Welcome back to the Grand Theft World podcast. Our guest tonight is Lee Camp. Now, Lee, this is your first time joining us here on the podcast. I've been a fan of your work for over 10 years. I really found Moment of Clarity to be like the breath of fresh air that was needed in the freedom, inspirational, kind of liberty-minded community, because heretofore we had like Daily Show and this kind of milquetoast agenda behind it. And I'd always thought, like, there's such tough information that we have to confront every day, and people don't want to deal with it. And they do. They cling to like the Daily Show type of let's make comedy and interject some political directives in that. But I was always hoping that somebody would come along and take the hard issues and present them, but make us laugh. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes a certain ingredient set that includes, like, you have to be able to understand the concept and then how to make it funny and have the courage to go there, but also have like the patience for letting people work it out on their own, you know, and not just beating them over the head with things, and the optimism that you've continually brought to through your work to millions and millions of people who otherwise it's like we're in the midst of all these dark stories all the time. Yeah. And you know, the censorship that they're now just admitting that they lie to us and no one cares, and like the whole milieu of people not thinking for themselves. So like, where did you come up with the idea that you could do these things for yourself? Because I'm pretty sure they don't teach us in school that we can be stand-up comedians, that we can be political commentators, that we're allowed to mix it ourselves and do it ourselves and be authentic and true to our message. Where did that originate with you?
Cool, man. Thanks for all the kind words. That's really, really kind of you. Yeah, I mean, it was a slow process for me. I think you probably hear this from a lot of people that kind of woke up to how fucked our system is and our world is. It usually takes years. I suppose some people have that aha moment, but for me, I wanted to be a comedian first. You know, it wasn't politics first, and I think you end up usually with the better comedians who actually get into cultural commentary and that type of thing usually started as comedians. Because if you try from day one to get on a stage and make people laugh at the darker issues, it's incredibly tough. You kind of got to learn to make them laugh, period. And then you can start getting good enough to add in all the darker and deeper stuff that's going to make them their worldview. So I started wanting to be a comedy writer at 12, started wanting to do stand up at 17. And then immediately after college, didn't really want to stick it through for college, but did anyway. Immediately after college, moved to New York to become a comedian. And at the time, you know, I had a little bit of cultural commentary in there, but very little. It was mainly, you know, what people have termed observational, which, you know, you could also term like having no fucking point. Just isn't it crazy how we pick up our dog's poop? But absolutely nothing deeper in the entire hour that they present on stage. But it quickly kind of started having some cultural commentary. And then the invasion of Iraq kind of woke me up to some level of the reality. I didn't get into the true heart of it, but just being like, you know, why are we destroying this country? For even if they did have weapons of mass destruction, we're just going to kill a million innocent people. Like it just made no sense to me. And seeing how little most people in our society cared that it made no sense was kind of mind blowing, and how much the media was lying to us about it was mind blowing. And so that's when I started reading more and getting deeper into things, and then putting it on stage, which at first was not easy. I would just factor it in a little bit and a little bit more. And it felt like if I am going to be doing almost the only thing that remains in American culture that I can think of, where you get to speak your own words unscripted almost every night of the week, there's not much else. I mean, yeah, there's some spoken word stuff, but it's not as big as stand-up comedy. It's not as prevalent. And so it is almost the only game out there for speaking your mind on a stage in front of people who want to come see the performance. And I was like, if I'm going to be up on a stage every night of the week in front of people, I want to have a point. I want to be talking about the real shit, and getting a laugh about deeper issues just felt more important, felt more pivotal. And so it grew from there to what it is now, which, on one hand, I'm kind of lucky. There aren't many people doing what I do. So it's like, I don't have that much competition. But on the other hand, it's like, I would love a lot more people to be doing what I do because, like you said, we're in such dark, dire times that how could I be that selfish? And I'm just like, this is great. I'm the only comedian talking about this stuff,
Yeah. It's a market you don't want a monopoly on. Right. Yeah. You want to have a lot of good other colleagues that you work with that do something similar, that you can not be competitive, but be collaborative and like complement and like be symbiotic with each other, help each other continue to coexist in the ecosystem that doesn't want truth spoken to power. And I like how you describe your journey, because going from the goal of wanting to be a comedian taught you how comedy works, right? And the methodologies of how to, get a premise to a punchline, these sort of things. But then while you were talking, it came that Oscar Wilde quote, if you're going to tell people the truth, you better make them laugh. Otherwise they'll kill you. Right. So you had that, how to make them laugh. And that gave you license to this. I can talk about the truth now because you can attach it back to this thing. And then you start talking about truth in a way that it's refreshing for the time, because there's been censorship going on for like the past 15 years, past 6 or 7 years, really hard, but it was trending like all the way in the early 21st century, if I go back, because I've been doing this like 20 years and I've been publishing for 16. So I've seen these trends go through time. And when you came on the scene, it was this, it's like a incendiary mixture of combustion, because you're giving, like, the truth is like the oxygen, but you already had the spark of comedy, and it's like a flamethrower. And it helps to, I think, rejuvenate people's curiosity for these topics that they think they already know about, but you poke little holes, and then you make people laugh about it. Yeah. And then they're more accepting of, yeah, I'm going to check out that thing he mentioned. Maybe I don't know that angle. Maybe I was reading too much establishment stuff, or people don't know there's anything different. Right. So like they're drinking the sand, and all of a sudden you show up and you're the water. And they're like, oh, this is very refreshing. Right. Yeah. So who were some of the comedic influences? Was it like a Lenny Bruce? Who were the truth spoken to power? Carlin? Who was it? Bill Hicks?
If you talk in general, then it started as not the ones that I ultimately came to love. It started as Jerry Seinfeld and stuff. Yeah. Although I guess I was into Chris Rock pretty early. But
observational comedy, Seinfeld, though I put the 2 socks in the dryer, only one came out. Where's that sock go? Where'd the other sock go? Well, you can create a lot of change in this world if you make people think about where the other sock went. And then it grew. At 16, 17, got into Carlin, Bill Hicks, even Doug Stanhope, some of the older ones, but some of the current ones. People don't give, I think, Chris Rock and some others enough credit for really being political comedians, because I think, weirdly, if you're Black, they don't consider it political comedian or cultural comedian. They just consider it being a Black comedian. So it's kind of bizarre. But like, I remember watching Bigger and Blacker when I was a kid, and he had like bits in there about how they're never going to cure AIDS because there's no money in the cure. And, that kind of stuff blew my mind. I'd never heard anybody say such a thing. And then, of course, you get a few years later, I'm like, oh, of course he's right. Like, yeah, there's no money in the cure. Now you have leaked memos from Goldman Sachs literally telling their investors not to fund, cures. So, so those people were very pivotal. Yeah, Doug Stanhope, Lewis Black. Definitely Carlin and Hicks. Lewis Black used to be the reason to watch The Daily Show back when he'd do those segments. He is awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, the Daily, I mean, and I love The Daily Show in my younger years too, but the Daily Show left me wanting, even, I think, fairly early, probably while I was still in college. It felt like it wasn't really fighting for any kind of large scale change. And ultimately we've now seen Jon Stewart and Colbert kind of say that. I remember a fairly recent interview with Colbert with Mark Maron. He says in it, like, people could never understand that I and John didn't want to be, like, we didn't want to be change creators. We just wanted to be comedians. We were not trying to enact change, and people couldn't understand that. And I was like, well, that actually explains a lot. You guys didn't really want to cause any change. Like,
but you can be a comedian and make this, or you can be over here and be a change maker and make this. And that's how they get people like that. Cause there's no way Stephen Colbert has a successful stand-up comedy career after that. Like, so his only thing is to climb higher and higher on that ladder. And
it took me a long time to realize that if you're really hitting at the center of capitalist America, of corporate America, then you're not wanted on these channels. I mean, I couldn't even get a 4-minute spot on Letterman back when I was in New York City, even though every book or every club knew me well. I was performing and doing great at the comedy clubs, and they didn't want me on those late night shows.
That speaks highly of you, because they did the same thing to Bill Hicks, right? He only had that one appearance.
No, he had several. He was on a bunch. He was on Letterman a bunch, but they approve your sets beforehand, and I think the sets that were mostly approved for him didn't have kind of the deeper, darker analysis. And then the final one before his death, they ultimately never aired because of his pro-life, anti pro-life and abortion joke or whatever. But yeah, it was still censorship. But the stuff that they allowed of him on those networks was not his. I think more of his deeper content.
All right, so that nails down the comedy aspect. Now let's talk politics, statecraft, history. Were you into history and current events when you were in high school? Did you want to be a journalist? What were the early aspirations of Lee Camp?
No, I mean, okay. I guess I wanted to be a comedy writer, and there's some journalism involved in that. So I did study some journalism in college. And I wrote for the paper, a humor columnist, of course, but no, it came with kind of figuring out. It wasn't like I sat down and said, I want to know history. It just, as the facade started to unravel, I realized that you needed that to understand. You needed to know back then to understand now. And it just has continued to unravel every day. I mean, I don't have the time in the day to do all of the reading. I wish I did. But, I do another podcast called Government Secrets, and we just go through, CIA operations and various plenty of things that the government has covered up, everything from the JFK assassination and Mary Meyer to, you just go down the list, and it's like, we will never run out of content for this show about everything that's been covered up about our history.
Yeah. I just did I did an interview this morning with a French podcast. And when I got on there, he's got his 10-year-old daughter, and he's like, she's going to ask the first question. I was like, okay. She said, how would you define conspiracy theory? So I was like, okay. So I broke the word apart. I defined those. I defined them together. And then I went to CIA document 1035-960 concerning criticism of the Warren Commission report about Edward J. Epstein's book Inquest, concerning criticism of how the Warren Commission came to their conclusions. And the CIA saw this as a big problem. So they get this 24-page memo. I had to get all into that. I find those artifacts fascinating because when I heard about Operation Northwoods, I was like, no way, James Bamford, because he's the first guy that puts it out in Body of Secrets. I'm like, no way. Then I get my hands on a document. I was like, well, maybe it's not authentic. Because like, over time, it's like, no, that's a real document. And those guys really had that plan. And Kennedy said no. And then Kennedy died. And then the guy Kennedy fired got in charge of the investigation, Dulles, right? Yep. There was all this about that. So I always became, on my journey, fascinated with what's the primary artifact, what's the first edition copy of the Bertrand Russell quote or the Woodrow Wilson quotes or whatever these things were. And I did it unintentionally too. I did it more out of necessity to figure out what is the terrain and what's the history of what's going on around here, because my map from schooling is not accurate.
I mean, and it is amazing how one tiny document can have major ramifications or prove something that seems like you'll never get to the bottom of it. I remember that so we had Citizens United, which said, money is speech. But before that, I can't remember, was it early 1900s? The Supreme Court, that the moment that they actually gave corporations personhood was like a side note in a docket. So that was on RT.
That's Tom's show, and the
Tom Harmon,
yeah, and it was Santa Clara County versus Union Pacific Railroad,
right.
1896 or 1898, and the Supreme Court Justice Morrison T. Waite was a Skull and Bones member. So I always thought, oh, the Skull and Bones made the corporate personhood, but then come to find out that it's a clerk's note on the top that gives an inaccurate assessment of the case itself, and that corporate personhood doesn't really exist. And yet all these prolific woes of the 20th and 21st century exist only because corporations, can do these things at the expense of the environment and individuals down the line, right? They outsource their expenses to us. So yeah, I agree, man. That stuff's fascinating, and more people need to know about the chain of causality.
Glad you knew all the names that I have forgotten.
Hey, man, that's part of what I do over here. Happy to provide service in any instance where you might find it interesting. Yeah, so that's good. So what were some of the major historical themes that you caught on to once you started looking into things for yourself, like with using your own observation and thinking skills, not from indoctrination and schooling, these sort of things?
I mean, I guess if we're talking broadly, the biggest one is that greed and profit and self-interest will always be at the center of the motivation. I have yet to find an American moment, let's say at least since World War II, but I'm sure we could go back farther than that, but where we have acted in a large way just to help people. Just to simply, just purely like, oh, this isn't going to benefit us in any way. We just need to help these people. It really doesn't exist. And so you understand reality far better if you realize that the people that have the most power are always acting from a place of greed and American hegemony.
So it's like the Lord Acton quote about power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think about, but what about Bono, man? Bono had that red campaign. He's going to help Africa, but come on, just buy the red iPod, Lee. Just do the thing and support the current thing, man.
How many child laborers were involved in making all those red shirts that everyone was wearing for 10 years?
Yeah. So I had that awareness too, where these nonprofit foundations, these so-called charities, they're supposed to be out there helping people. It's plunder. It's plunder under like a legal guise of being able to, right? Yeah. What's some of the like more famous landmarks along the way? Any documentaries or books or people you met that really helped you gain insight into like the supra politics aspect of what's going on?
I mean, there were definitely pivotal people, some of which I've become disenchanted with over the past decade, but I think they helped me on my journey. So,
sure.
But the beginning reading Chomsky and
me too. Yep.
Watching Democracy Now! And, many of these things have unfortunately given in to a lot of the U.S. propaganda, but
Chomsky did Manufacturing Consent. He did all his little books, but like his one with Edward Herman, the Manufacturing Consent, like that's some legit work, right? Mm-hmm. But then a couple months ago, he said, if you don't have a vaccine, you can't get food. And I was like, okay, that's older Chomsky. Like just because the messenger has changed doesn't mean the message that was true in the past doesn't, So there's yeah, go ahead.
I had him on for, my show has been canceled now thanks to U.S. sanctions, but I had him on like 5-6 months ago or something. It was the only time I ever interviewed him. And everything was going fine until I mentioned something he has said, which is that the two corporate parties agree on 80 to 90% of the core structure of our country. And he goes, oh, well, that used to be true, but is no longer since Trump or something like that. And basically it was like the Republicans are the true evil or whatever. And I'm like, well, no, things have not changed.
Yeah. I mean, I got a book here. Tragedy and Hope, The History of the World in Our Time by Carol Quigley. And he says in here, like page 1200, he's like the two parties, it's like, it's a control system from the left and the right, and that they'll use anarchists to extremists on the other side and everyone in between, and that they don't favor one side or the other. And you can tell that through U.S. Foreign policy. No matter who's in the White House, CIA and MI6 are out there conducting coups. And whether it's like William Bloom's expository work on, America's deadliest exports and these sort of things, there's a long chain of abuses that goes back to like 1898 with the white man's burden, where Kipling said, hey, America, let's do internationalist things with your cousin of Britain. And we got into the Spanish-American War. And then the whole 20th century was that being kind of unfolded, right? And we see in America, we see like, CIA was involved with all these things, but CIA was like a creation of the empire. And we had our British cousins with us on all those Operation Ajax, kind of Mossadegh overthrow operations. So what Chomsky's saying is, what Quigley said in 66, or what Chomsky said a couple years ago, he's saying no longer applies because of Trump. Well, Trump's not a factor anymore. Trump's out. And I'm apolitical. I haven't voted since 2004 when I started researching that the car in the back seat of the steering wheel I have in the back seat doesn't steer the car. And
I used to do a joke about that. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I used to have a stand-up joke where I was like, voting is like the little plastic steering wheel that they have for the toddler sitting in the car, and so we can all sit there and go, I'm steering, and I would say I would give the caveat that I think you can have more impact in local elections. There is some impact you're going to have, ballot initiatives, things like that. But on the federal level, it's been completely bought out.
All right, that's excellent, because I know I've said it recently. I've been saying that for years, but recently there was a meme. We had a picture of a kid in the back seat with the steering wheel, and I just had a friend write to me about that, and now I can say I got that from Lee Camp. I'm sorry, I didn't remember I got that from comedy, but that's a great example of how your comedy permeates society. And I'm not thinking of it as a reference, right? It came into my head, and at some point I just thought that was my idea. But that's your comedic observation.
I'm fine with
proving itself.
It could have been, in comedy, you run into something that we comedians.
Let's not go Carlos Mencia on the whole conversation.
No. I'm not going Carlos Mencia. No, we run into something that comedians call parallel thought, which can be true for like an idea, like the fact that fake steering wheel is us voting. That's an idea. But when someone's stealing shit like Carlos Mencia is when it's far more than just the broad idea. It is like word for word, or it's the punchline of multiple lines, like,
or it's somebody's how they get paid too, right? Yeah. So I wasn't intentionally stealing your paycheck or anything like that. All right, let's talk about the censorship, because like I said earlier, it's been ramping up. And from my perspective, for them to conduct psychological warfare on us successfully, they have to dumb down the population. They then have to censor, and that's like the taking out these troops so they can come in and carpet bomb us with propaganda. And they've been doing it since Ukraine started, like more so than ever, more obviously, more admittedly. Shallow. It's declassified, because I said last week it's declassified circular arguments by these guys, Ned Price and all those guys. So it's hard to watch, because in this post-fact, post-truth world that they announced years ago, they're like, we're going to officially propagandize American citizens under NDAA. And then they say we're in a post-fact, post-truth world. Now they've just bent it all so far out of shape that people can hear contradiction after contradiction after contradiction, and they're not reconciling any of them. And they'll just believe whatever they're told on any given day. I think that's a threat to freedom, because anytime you have people assuming without looking and observing for themselves, like, you get into a situation where they could take away your rights and your freedom. So
it's
you've been on the front lines. You got censored.
Yeah.
You were working with RT.
Yeah.
And that gave us the occasion to be like, hey, get Lee on the show. Let's see how we can help out, because people who do what you do need to continue doing it far into the future and have many, many, many more people doing likewise, just like you said. So how did you come to work at RT? How did you like working there? Did you ever experience Putin top down? You got to say this on behalf of Russia, right? Like, yeah. And how did that all unfold? And then what led up to the censorship?
Yeah. So like you said, or you mentioned, I was doing this years ago. I guess I gained some notoriety with my online videos during Occupy, completely independent. They weren't being done for anyone. And then I think the Moment of Clarity videos got me some unpaid spots on Abby Martin's show and Max Kaiser's show and various other RT shows. And so then RT America came to me over 8 years ago and said, can you make a comedy show? And it was their first comedy show, ultimately was their only comedy show. And I said, yeah, sure. And, assuming I'd get to write and say whatever I wanted and never be censored. And sure enough, I was correct. I got to write and say, and I wrote every word I ever said, everything I ever wanted. I was never censored. I was never told what to say. I was never told not to say anything. I was never told to phrase anything different. I never had anything cut out of the show. And people can't believe that. They assume that if you're at RT America, well, you must have had all this heavy censorship. In fact, it was, it's no longer in existence, but it was the polar opposite of what we know and has publicly been stated is how Fox News or MSNBC or these other networks work. Fox News famously, it came out that there were directives on what to say each day. MSNBC, there's clips of live on air, Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, I'm sure one of your favorite people, saying that he says to her, he goes, remember a few years ago when they used to send us notes on what we had to say on the show? And as if, that's not true anymore. But it goes to show that's how MSNBC works. And you have career graveyards filled with people who simply just came out against the Iraq war or against some level of war, and they were purged from those networks. Phil Donahue, Jesse Ventura, Ed Schultz was purged from MSNBC just for being for healthcare, basically. Melissa Harris Perry got kicked out and went on Democracy Now! And said that she wasn't even allowed to cover the Beyonce Super Bowl halftime show because the costumes were Black Power, Black Panther inspired. And therefore the head of MSNBC came running into her office to tell her they were not doing the segment. That's the level of censorship of these other networks. Whereas I was never censored in any way. So that led up to recently where within a span of a day, I don't think any of them saw it coming, U.S. sanctions, and I don't know the details, but somehow made it impossible for the network to continue. And they really told us nothing except see you later. There were no mumblings of, this network could continue or you could be back or we could do something else. It all just ended in the span of a day. And then within the span of 3 days, all of the back episodes of Redacted Tonight, 8 years worth, over 1,000 videos and video clips, all banned globally on YouTube. And my podcast, Moment of Clarity, deleted from Spotify. And that was all the span of 3 days. So.
You should get trophies for those things.
Yeah, right? I know. Seriously.
When you get banned from YouTube, at least they send you a trophy. Said you had all these videos and we took them away. Those are like calling cards of courage these days. It means you were speaking truth to power in such a way that they're like, well, we can't have that out there. We can't have it out there. Even if you're not really associated, your work, Moment of Clarity, is not really associated with RT other than they license what you do over there. But you have that pre-existing to the RT relationship.
Yeah,
right?
Moment of Clarity, the podcast is completely my own. It still exists. It's just not on Spotify, but completely my own, independent, not funded or connected to RT America, except that I would sometimes use some of the audio from Redacted Tonight. So I assume that's why Spotify deleted it.
Because they could. All right. So did you lose the content in actuality, or is it just lost from those platforms?
It's still up. Most of Redacted Tonight is still up on Odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com. And, there's there's little bits on Rockfin, but I guess the place that has the most of it is Odyssey.
I would like for there in the future to be a place where all of Lee Camp's work is archived and available online via IPFS, the Interplanetary File Sharing System. Do you know about that?
Mm-mm.
All right. So IPFS, Interplanetary File Sharing System, they had a hypothesis of if we want to go to Mars, how would we communicate back and forth? And they developed a file sharing system, kind of like BitTorrent for information, right? So in Earth terms, it's a way to put something up on the internet that can't be pulled down, can't be censored. We call it indelible publishing. And right now we're doing a prototype of that for the Grand Theft World podcast. And we know a whole bunch of other people that we're working with kind of R&D to get that done. But it means you could take your WordPress website and have all the content coming from your IPFS indelible publishing populating there and all the places where you want to distribute. So upload once, indelible, put out wherever you want, and let them whack-a-mole all these different places, but they can never pull your presence from being available on the internet.
Nice. So yeah, the decentralized model.
Yeah. So that's future thinking. I was just, catching that issue. So you already had your website pre-existing to RT. So when RT lets you go, you fall back to Patreon. You already had Rockfin and you had a website set up, right? LeeCamp.net still?
Yeah, but it's either LeeCamp.net or LeeCamp.com. Yeah, still that still exists. I created a Patreon once we were deleted, so that's patreon.com/LeeCamp. And then still have a Rockfin, and I have a much smaller YouTube page. Who knows when they'll delete that one, the Moment of Clarity page, but
when they find it, but they're not looking real hard right now. They got, the world shaken up by Elon Musk today. No one's looking to
actually, someone just sent me yesterday, Google's notice saying that they will be demonetizing or deleting anything that basically doesn't acknowledge. Hold on, I have the wording here. Dear publisher, due to the war in Ukraine, we will pause monetization of content that exploits, dismisses, or condones the war. And then they get into some details. But basically that they consider condoning the war anything that doubts the U.S. propaganda line.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about NATO for a minute. What do you know? How did you find out? Did you know about NATO in high school? When did you start learning about NATO? And what do you think of it today and what's going on?
I mean, I suppose I've been studying it a lot more recently, but when I was in high school, I believed this goes for just about everything, but I believed the U.S. media line that NATO was this kind of defensive structure, right? It's a group of countries just saying, look, we want peace, man. And we're just going to hold hands and create peace. And then and I think a lot of Americans, they may not believe quite that, but they believe that it is a peace-oriented organization of a cooperation of countries. But you don't have to study it long to see oh no, NATO creates war and is a belligerent structure and pushes us towards another world war, and just completely took Libya from one of the most advanced African countries to just warlords fighting in open slave markets, and just completely destroyed it. I mean, and Kosovo, and NATO does nothing but cause harm and war. And my analogy is it's like the Christmas wreath on the pedophile's home. It's just there to make you feel it's all right. The NATO tag, the brand name, just makes you think everything's fine.
That's good, dude. That's an accurate assessment. Yeah. So when I looked into the origins of NATO, I'd already figured out that the Americans and the British had selected certain Nazis that they wanted to continue working with, and they started putting them in positions of power.
Like the ones that helped us get to the moon.
Yeah. Like those ones, and like the ones in Ukraine right now. Yeah. So there's stay behind Operation Gladio aspects of those intelligence agencies kind of having the protection against the Soviet communists coming this way. But really, it's gangsters, terrorists, black marketeers, arms dealing, keeping the world off balance. It's a fascinating study to see.
Do you feel do you feel like what's going on in Ukraine has outed the complete willingness of the U.S. empire to work with Nazis? It feels more obvious than it has before.
I think what it outs is they've been working with Nazis the whole time, and that the Nazi movement didn't start in Germany and it continued much longer. And those people are still in power today, for lack of a better expression of it. And there's a lot to it. There's the transhumanist aspect, the cybernetic aspect, but it all revolves around controlling people. It's all about people control. And if you can control people through getting them to acquiesce, critical thinking, creative problem solving, and just assume authority says is true, then you've got them as automatons, and they don't have to have chains anymore or cages for all of us, or cattle prods. They've got us believing things that aren't true, and that's how they have command and control.
The most maybe where the quote comes from. The most brilliant kind of slave is one that doesn't know they're a slave. But
I have a plaque in the studio behind me, and it's a quote from Steve Biko: "The most powerful weapon in the mind, or in the hands of the oppressor, is the mind of the oppressed." Right. So the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
Bob Marley: "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind."
Yeah.
These thoughts have been out there for us to grasp, but they've been implicit.
We are Plato's, prisoners in the cave, looking at the shadows on the wall and believing the shadows on the wall are reality. except maybe the slight difference is that the shadows are intentionally being manipulated. It's not just random shadows of people walking by. It is they are shadows that are carefully shown to us as reality.
All right. So in Plato's Republic, there's a quote where they said, it is he who they appreciate the least who brings them the truth. Right. And so the idea in Plato's cave is if you try to go in and tell these people, hey, these are shadows and they're being manipulated, they kill you. Right. Yeah. So our job as media creators is to make something from the outside world and reflect it in and put it on that wall and compete with those shadows and say, look, we got clear color, high definition. You guys got black and white, flickery thing. Like, watch our stuff and then start to open up, emancipate yourself and get out, because we can't free those people in the cave. They have to learn to free themselves, just like we did for ourselves at some point. Through the story, either as like all at once or over time, people come to that higher level awakening, and they can see it today in this Ukraine situation. With first off, let's talk like they did the 2004 color revolution in Ukraine, and then they did the 2014 coup in Ukraine. And in that 2014, it was Vicki Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt, and George Soros having these meetings. There's meeting minutes, notes from these meetings. And where they're
and there's leaked audio of Nuland as well.
Yeah. I have the leaked audio, as well. But there's no leaked audio from the Soros meetings that they had. So then you've got this coup, this overthrow, this setup for what we see today, where they take this guy who was like, I don't want to call him a comedian, but he was doing funny stuff on stage in Ukraine before he became president.
No, he was a comedian. I mean, not a stand-up comedian, but he was a comedic actor. And what better to be a puppet to a billionaire than a comedic actor?
Right. Like Trump was both in the same, but over there they got a separate billionaire from the puppet.
Yeah, right. And what was the maybe the name of the billionaire that like funds most of his campaign and everything, but that guy also owns the media airwaves where his show, Zelensky's show, where he played the president of Ukraine, was aired tirelessly. So basically, this billionaire helped create the TV show that showed him as the anti-corruption president of Ukraine, then played it on his own television channels and got everyone to become huge fans of it, because you're going to like most of what's on TV a lot, and then ran his campaign and funded his campaign to become president. So you got to assume it was a plan from the beginning. I mean, it seems to have worked perfectly.
Yeah, it's a very wag the dog world, and he was cast for that role, and that's why he's like going to the Grammys and doing photo shoots and doing the rest of it. Yeah. So, what do you think long term? I mean, because what I saw was, of course, Putin's going to move in at some point, and they provoked him and kind of even said, "You can move in. We're not going to do anything." And because NATO started out like 13 countries, then it went to 33 countries. And so come on, man, like you guys said, not 1 inch, and then you did this, and then it's like, oh, that guy's bad. And he's not a great guy. Like, he's a cunning character.
He doesn't have to be a great guy for it to be like they knew what they were doing. They were encircling Russia. I think there's 17 NATO countries that are essentially right on Russia, some of them actually touching. And he kept saying, and the irony is that Putin was the hand-selected successor to capitalist, Western capitalism's guy, Yeltsin. And so they thought Putin was going to play along. And for a long time he did. But eventually he basically said, like, this is a red line for Russia. You're infringing on Russia's national security. You're putting missiles on our border. And there was a Wall Street Journal article, I think today, that said, why has the Ukrainian military done so well? NATO training. So we're outwardly admitting we have trained the Ukrainian military to fight Russia. And so, he maybe you can argue he took the bait, but, I don't know how many moves down the road he thought. So maybe he planned for all this and he knew these sanctions would come. But you look at the deeper level, and the U.S. is a late stage capitalist fading empire. It sees the writing on the wall that there was economic cooperation happening between Russia, China, and the EU. It was increasing, and the U.S. is using this in multiple levels of trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China, successfully driving a wedge between Russia and the EU, and turning the EU back into kind of feudal states. I mean, their economies are going to borderline collapse over all this. So the U.S. is getting a lot of what they wanted from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even it's a extra U.S. plan. It's a bigger plan than just anything to do with the U.S. So, like from a Putin standpoint, he's with Xi Jinping on UN 2030 agenda and that whole kind of internationalist agenda. He's up to speed, even though he's broken off recently with the World Economic Forum. Like, he's been with them and at their meetings for a long time. So is he playing a role for them in that bigger picture? Yet to be discerned. But they have played together before. And then, yeah, the United States being tied to the petrodollar and post Bretton Woods, take us off gold, attach us to the Saudis, oil. Here's kind of why that's coming to fruition. When the Saudis wanted water in the 1920s, it was American British companies that said, we'll drill for water, give you the water, we keep the oil. And they had a 99-year lease on that. Now, I forget what year that was, but we're approaching the end of that lease. And since the Saudi oil was really the only thing holding up the dollar, while they were just printing it like it's going out of style the past 2 years, man. Mm-hmm. It's that scene from Goodfellas where Paulie buys into the restaurant, they run up the credit, they sell it out the back door, they burn it down and get the insurance money and do a great reset. Change over the whole system to not cryptocurrency, but a sovereign digital currency system that they're planning, the central bank digital currencies. And then you have command and control of people economically, which is like the immune system of the world. They're weakening it right now with the crash and the inflation and the rising cost of living. But that's like the propaganda before the Psy war, the censorship. That's what they're doing with breaking down the economy. There's another step they seek to unfold, and weakening us all and making us all kind of less than mobile and capable as we'd like to be is part of that. So I see that continuing to unfold as we go in. But how do we bring back, like, how do we battle censorship? Do we tuck our tail between our legs? And do we become submissive and compliant, or do we find new, interesting ways to bring this information out to people? And what are your thoughts about the future of freedom?
Yeah, I think I've been saying for years, I perhaps didn't think it'd be me that was canceled quite this much, but I've been saying for years that you need to build up the alternatives, which I know you have worked hard on, building up the alternatives to these social media platforms that are owned by these tech corporations, while still using them, because they are so massive that you're letting go, as an activist, you're letting go of a massive tool to just step away from them. And, if I were to, so like an example is my Facebook page used to be my biggest thing 10 years ago or 6, 7 years ago. And I was gaining 5,000 people a week. I had 330,000 followers. And then in 2016, they essentially shadow banned it to death. I mean, now 0.1% of people actually see my posts, despite me having the same number of so-called followers. But if I were to just delete my platforms now, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, et cetera, I would just be throwing away all of those people that still do see my posts. So to me, it's a matter of building up these alternatives that are pretty much uncensorable. Things like Panquake, and there's other examples out there that hopefully will do a far better job of not being censored, of not giving into the U.S. propaganda line or Western propaganda line. And I think we got to do both at the same time. But the other thing you mentioned is we have to come up with new and creative ways to get the information forward, because it is true, and it's really fucking sad that they have broken down the attention span to such a tiny degree. You're lucky if someone will watch 3 minutes of something, but I think to some degree we should play to that. Not just throw up our hands and say, sorry, I'm just doing the same old thing I've always done, because if we had been doing this in the 80s and we were all paper based, then if we'd had that mantra, we'd still be doing paper based analysis. So, my videos have gotten faster, and, the images pop up quicker, and, there's no intro song. It just dives right into it, because, people are going to turn it off. And I don't love that attention span is so short, but I do think you have to experiment with new models and new styles. And, for content creators out there, they should find out what the thing is that they're really good at and focus on that thing. For me, it's inserting comedy into this stuff. For other people, it's doing it via music. It's doing it via spoken word. It's for you, I think it seems to be the brilliant ability to find all the historical documents and reference them. And so people should find out what they're good at and really focus on that.
Yeah. And I've created long form content because I've always seen that people's attention spans aren't long enough to take in the problem in order to get to the solution. So even though it's not popular because people got these 8-second goldfish mentalities, I'm always looking for the people who can and who wants to direct their attention in a focused way to learn something substantial and kind of give them the opportunity. So early in my career, I had 12-hour podcasts, but then it got into 20-hour podcasts. That's all in history. So it would have all the samples that you want to hear up front and then the source material, which makes it long. I'm preserving it in a time capsule for the future. Mm-hmm. So they have a better idea of history than we inherited, right?
Well, and this gets to kind of what I was saying, which is, what is it for each person? What is it they're serving to create a change or to create an awareness? And you need, just like you need somebody who's doing the short comedic stuff. You need somebody who's doing the in-depth stuff, and you need intellectuals as well, so there are more intellectual styled people like Chris Hedges, that much of which his stuff I really appreciate. And it's not for everyone, you're not gonna get the 22-year-old to sit through the Chris Hedges.
Yeah, you gotta be a nerd.
What's that?
Get your nerd on with Hedges,
Yeah,
thinking cap.
So there are all these different aspects of creating change and creating awareness, and I think we need them all.
Yeah, I agree. How can we help each other grow in the right direction to preserve freedom? Because I think we enjoyed a lot of it during our lifetime, and now that we're adults and it's waning, I mean, who else do we expect? There's no superheroes coming in to save us. So we all have to learn how to kind of be our own superhero for each other. All right, so let's talk about going forward. Do you have any big projects on the horizon? What are the things you're looking to do that this RT thing has thrown a hiccup in your plan?
So yeah, I have a new online show I'll be announcing in a week or two. It'll be kind of like 5 or 10 minute segments, but it'll be similar to the kind of first half of Redacted Tonight without the correspondence. But and hopefully people will really enjoy and get something out of that. And then I will keep doing my other content that I've been doing at patreon.com/Lee Camp. I have 3 podcasts: Common Censored, which is more about kind of on the ground activism and the day-to-day fights that are happening across the country. Government Secrets, which is more historical and things our government doesn't want us to know about. And then Moment of Clarity, which is kind of all my other videos and stuff put in audio platform. So you can get my live streams and everything on that as well.
Any stand-up planned in the future?
I mean, I still love doing it. I did 10 minutes for an Assange benefit the other night, but it has become very tough to plan something like that, both because of my schedule right now is just kind of insane. But beyond that, it's like things kept, you'd start to plan a tour and then things would go on lockdown or whatever, or people just didn't feel comfortable coming out or whatever the reasons. So I haven't planned much right now.
All right. And last question, and I'll let you go. If you could say something that everyone in the future heard, it just became a common idea that they held because it was just so obvious, what would you have to offer?
Oh man, but to shrink it down to a few sentences. Get outside the market economy. Realize what really matters in life. I mean, we are living through, I'd say in the broadest sense, we are living through abstractions. We have really lost what matters to being human. That doesn't mean we don't have glimpses of it. You walk outside on a nice day and you look up and you think of how beautiful life is or how gorgeous a tree is or whatever. But 98% of the time we're walking around living in these bizarre abstractions that we are told matter more than anything else. In many ways, especially if you aren't doing what you aren't able to do your passion in life. And I consider myself incredibly privileged that I'm able to perform my passion as my job, but most people aren't. I don't know what the percentages are, but let's say over 90% of people are essentially wage slaves. You're born free, and then you spend the rest of the time trying to rent back your life, your freedom. You spend the rest of the time trying to rent back basically your weekend, maybe if you have a weekend. So you work 5 days a week to try and rent freedom on 2 days a week. Like, it's the most insane system, and it's just like accepted as, that's just, and people consider them lucky. It's like, yeah, man, I got a weekend. I got healthcare. Like, we have been so indoctrinated into it that we consider ourselves lucky if we're able to afford, healthcare for our kids. The goalpost keeps moving for what's considered a lucky life.
So you agree with John Lennon's Working Class Hero lyrics then? That's essentially
working class.
Yeah.
Working class hero and Imagine, which, I love that Yoko Ono once said that people still to this day constantly ask her if they can use the song Imagine for various causes and things. But the number one question is, we just want to take out the line about no religion.
Well, Dulles Brothers, just real quick, Dulles Brothers took over the World Union of Churches or whatever back in the day. So that was an aspect through which they control the population. But yeah, so much to be.
I didn't even know there was a World Union of Churches.
Oh, it's a World Council of Churches is what it was called. And it was John Foster Dulles, I'm pretty sure, was in charge of like heading that up. So between he and Alan, they did a bang up job. Lee, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule, investing a little bit of yourself with the audience and making them laugh along the way, continually informing us. And we all want to see you survive and thrive. So please, if there's anything we can do, if you want to do like a monthly or weekly segment or something to add to the show, we could do one of those paid appearance things if you want, not those non-paid appearance things. I'm looking to make sure that you float out there and continue being the best dad you can be.
That's really cool, you man. And let's keep chatting on that front and keep doing what you're doing. Keep the fight going.
Right on. Thanks for the inspiration. Be well. Peace.
Thank you, Richard.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions. We can get into the show and share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man.